Some of the most important things I ever passed on. Didn't look like much at first. A small boat, a torn net, a few words scribbled in an old journal. Same goes for people. And sometimes, even lives you thought were already finished. In this story, I'm going to tell you about a couple who came here chasing freedom, a storm that took everything, and a lesson I had to relearn about legacy, stillness, and why the sea reveals far more than it takes. So grab your coffee, settle in, and listen close. Because this one's not just about fishing, or business, or even the past. It's about what you build when you finally stop running. And why the sea, unpredictable, beautiful, dangerous, and generous, might be the best teacher you'll ever meet. The sea doesn't care if you're ready. It just comes. That's the first thing I told them. This young couple who showed up last spring, eyes full of salt and dreams, dragging their mismatched hopes onto the sand like suitcases they barely packed. They were barefoot, smiling, asking if I knew where to find fish. I didn't tell them that the sea doesn't give fish, it lends them. Instead, I pointed to the old wooden bench under the palm tree where I drink my coffee every morning. "You'll want to sit down," I said. "You've got time now. Use it." They laughed, gently, politely. Not to offend, but not to listen either. I've seen that look before. That soft arrogance of those who believe they're discovering a world that's been living without them for centuries. The kind of arrogance I once carried in my own chest. I didn't always live here, you know. There was a time when my morning view was ticker symbols, not tides. A time when I judged the weather not by clouds, but by market sentiment. But after years of building capital, I realized I'd never really built peace. That's when I left the suits behind and moved to the sea. You see, out here, the sea keeps score differently. They showed up with a boat too new and a net too old, worn rope, gaps between the knots. It would have been poetic if it wasn't so dangerous. I asked where they got it. They said it was a gift from a friend. That's the problem. Too many people out here fishing with borrowed nets. But I didn't say that out loud. Instead, I said, "Before you take that boat out, patch those holes." They nodded, thanked me, and the very next morning, of course, they were gone with the tide, grinning like adventurers. And just like that, they were in the water. And I was waiting. I've seen this before. People think the sea is freedom, and in a way it is. But it's also the final exam. It doesn't test what you learned last week. It tests what you've been preparing for all your life. The wind picked up by mid-afternoon. Not a storm, just a reminder. The kind of swell that teaches respect to those who mistake calmness for kindness. By sundown, I spotted their boat coming back, empty, wet, and the boy, shivering and silent, held a piece of the net in his hand like it betrayed him. I didn't say "I told you so." I just handed them towels. And then I said something I hadn't said in years. "Let me show you how to mend a net." My hands moved slowly, teaching more than stitching. You see, patching holes isn't just about rope. It's about patience, precision. It's about seeing the thing that could fail before it does. That's business. That's love. That's life. "Why does it matter?" the girl asked. "We'll be out again tomorrow." I looked at her the way the sea does, quiet, long, without blinking. "Because the hole that sinks you tomorrow is the one you ignore today." They didn't speak after that. Not much, just watched. And for the first time, I think they began to understand. The real work of freedom isn't in the sailing. It's in the mending, the preparing, the waiting. The sea doesn't reward spontaneity. It rewards preparation. It took me decades and millions to learn that. They were learning it on a Tuesday. But here's the thing no one tells you. It's not the big wave that breaks most people. It's the tiny leak they never noticed, the habits they excused, the conversations they avoided, the business partner they never fully trusted, the investment they made with more hope than due diligence. It's the hole in the net. That night, while they slept in their small tent not far from the dunes, I sat outside watching the moon cast silver across the water. I thought about the markets, the decisions I'd made, the ones I'd avoided. I thought about the people who used to ask me for stock tips, and how what they really needed was something else entirely. A reminder that life is not about beating the storm. It's about being someone who still floats after it. And that's when I realized something. Most people think the ocean is the risk, but in truth, they are the risk. Their neglect, their assumptions, their empty confidence. The sea, it's just being the sea. I started seeing them every morning after that. They'd wake up just before sunrise, blurry-eyed and stiff from the cold night air, and walk across the sand with that net rolled up under the boy's arm. Cleaner now, tighter, no holes I could see. But I knew they were still there. The real ones. Not in the net. In them. She was always more curious, more open, asking questions about the tides, the winds, the currents. He, on the other hand, was quiet. Not defensive, but proud. The kind of silence that says, I want to learn, but I don't want to feel small doing it. I recognized it. I'd worn it for years. One morning she brought over a piece of coral, small, bleached, almost delicate. I think it's beautiful, she said, handing it to me like a child giving a gift they found in the dirt. I nodded. You know what made it white like that? She shook her head. Time. Pressure. Exposure. What you see now is what's left after everything else was stripped away. She looked down, quiet. I added, some things get more valuable after they've survived. That day, they caught their first fish. 2, actually. Small, silver, flopping against the wooden bucket like tiny trophies of persistence. They came running to show me, laughing, proud. But when they asked if I'd like to share the meal with them that night, I said no. Not out of rudeness, but because the lesson wasn't finished yet. That night, I watched them from a distance, their small fire crackling by the dunes. They cooked the fish like kids learning from a recipe written in sand. Too much heat, not enough patience. And still, they smiled. They didn't know yet what it takes to feed yourself consistently. That one fish isn't a livelihood. That surviving one day doesn't mean you've built a life. A few days later, he came to me alone. Something had shifted. He was quieter than usual. Not just silent, but humbled. He sat beside me on the bench, didn't say a word for a long time. Then, I thought I was ready, he finally said. I thought I could just figure it out. I didn't interrupt. He continued. Back in the city, I had a tech job, remote, decent money. I hated it. Felt like I was building something that didn't matter. And now? I asked. He looked toward the sea. I realize I brought that same thinking here. Quick, digital, reactive, but the ocean, it doesn't work like that. I nodded. It doesn't, I said. Neither does life. He asked me then, something I didn't expect. How did you know when it was time to leave? I had to pause for that one, not because I didn't have the answer, but because it still hurt. I left when I realized I had everything I wanted, but I no longer liked the person who wanted it. The silence afterward was heavy, honest. You were rich, he asked. I smiled. I am. But I didn't feel wealthy until I was sitting right here, watching a boy learn to tie knots with his own hands. Over the next few weeks, we worked on the net together. They fished more often, ate more confidently, laughed a little deeper, and something began to change in them. Not just skill, but awareness. They started asking different questions. Not, how do I catch more fish, but how do I build something that lasts? One evening, I invited them to my house. They'd never seen it up close. Just a few glimpses of the porch, the chair, the fishing tools. Inside, it was simple. Books, maps, a few photos. One of a woman smiling on the beach. My wife, gone now, but never absent. She loved this life, I said, watching them scan the walls. She taught me how to wait, how to read the sea, how to leave things better than I found them. They stayed late. We talked about business, but not stocks. About relationships, but not romance. About wealth, but not money. They didn't realize it, but I was teaching them how to diversify not just their investments, but their identity. Too many people put everything they are into one basket, one job, one person, one version of themselves. Then they're shocked when the tide pulls it away. Right before they left, she looked at me and said, "We thought we came here to escape, but now I think we came to build something." I didn't answer. I just smiled, because that's the moment I'd been waiting for. But just as they were beginning to find their rhythm, the storm came. Not a metaphor, a real one. 3 days of wind and waves, violent and unapologetic. Their tent didn't hold. The boat flipped. The net washed away. Everything they'd built, gone. Or so it seemed. But here's the truth I've learned. Storms don't destroy what's real. They destroy what was never built right to begin with. And when the winds finally died down, what mattered wasn't what they lost. It was what they'd learned. The morning after the storm, the beach looked like it had forgotten how to breathe. Palm branches twisted across the sand like fallen arms. Debris floated in and out with the waves. The sky was quiet, but not peaceful, like a room just after a fight. And where the couple's tent used to be, there was nothing. I walked down slowly, not with panic, but with a kind of knowing. The sea doesn't always take things maliciously. Sometimes it takes them to reset the board. I found them about 100 yards up the shoreline, curled under a tarp half buried in sand. Their faces were raw, lips cracked, eyes hollowed by cold and shock. The boat was gone. The net, too. They had nothing, except each other. And strangely, that's when I saw something I hadn't seen before. Stillness. Not silence, not defeat. Stillness. He looked up first. No words. Just eyes meeting mine with a question he wasn't ready to ask out loud. She followed. Face pale, but somehow more grounded than before. "We lost everything," she said, voice hoarse. I sat beside them, pulling the tarp closer around their shoulders. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe now you'll figure out what was worth keeping." They stayed in my house for the next few days, not as guests, as survivors. It changed the rhythm. No more casual lessons on knots or currents. Now we were talking about systems, backup plans, contingency strategies. Not just for storms, but for life. "This isn't about the sea," I told them. "This is about how you prepare for what you don't see coming." The truth is, I wasn't prepared either. Not for how their presence started opening rooms inside me I thought I'd sealed. Rooms filled with memories of my wife, and of a life I'd built so carefully, only to abandon when I no longer recognized myself in it. I realized I'd been treating this quiet life like a bunker, a place to hide. But maybe it was time for it to become a lighthouse again. One night after a meal in silence, he looked up and asked, "Did you ever lose everything?" I paused. Then I said, "No. But I've lost the things that made everything else feel worth it." He nodded like he understood. She reached across the table and held his hand, quietly, firmly. And just like that, the first beam of something new broke through. A few days later, we started rebuilding, together. We didn't talk about it. We just moved. Driftwood turned into frame, old tarp into cover. We found parts of the net tangled in rocks, salvaged what we could. We built not just shelter, but structure. That's when I taught them the most important rule I ever learned in business. Don't rebuild what failed. Build what should have been built in the first place. They wrote it down, but more importantly, they lived it. That week, we talked about diversification, not in portfolios, in identity. I asked them who they would be if the sea took everything again, if the business failed, if love turned distant, if health declined. "Who are you when the net breaks?" I asked. They didn't answer right away, but that question echoed for days. Then came the breakthrough. They decided to stay. Not just through the season, indefinitely. They'd find a way, sell small crafts, offer lessons, build something that could breathe with the rhythm of the tide instead of fighting it. They weren't running anymore. They were designing. That's when I made my move. I walked them to the back of the house, opened the old wooden storage shed. Inside, an unused fishing boat. Strong, seasoned, reliable, the one I built for my wife, but never had the heart to use after she passed. "I want you to have it," I said. They refused at first. Then I said the same words she once told me. "It's not a gift, it's a continuation." He cried, not openly, just enough. And I realized in that moment that the real investment I'd made all these years wasn't in stocks or funds or properties. It was in the capacity to pass something on, something that doesn't decay, something the sea can't wash away, wisdom, conviction, legacy. And then came the Reviravolta, not in them, in me. That night I opened the drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside, a letter, yellowed, unread, from my wife, written the night before she passed. I hadn't had the courage. But now, something was different. I unfolded the paper, 4 lines, simple, clean, honest. If you're reading this, it means you're still here. And if you're still here, you're not done. I stared at those words like they were coordinates on a map. Like maybe I'd finally stopped floating. The lighthouse wasn't just for them. It was for me too. I read the letter again the next morning, and then again later that night. I wasn't trying to memorize it. I was letting it settle, like sediment in still water. Letting it show me what had always been there, if I'd been brave enough to look. The next week felt different, not because the weather changed or because the sea was kinder, but because I had changed. For years I'd built walls of silence and called them peace. Now, I was building bridges again, one conversation, one gesture at a time. They were rebuilding too. With the new boat, they learned not just how to sail, but how to wait. Waiting for the right tide, waiting for the wind to shift. Waiting, not as weakness, but as strategy. She called it investing in patience. I laughed. "You're starting to sound like me." She smiled. "No, I'm starting to sound like her." They'd never met my wife. But somehow, through the things I'd said, the way I stacked the nets, boiled the coffee, folded the maps, she was there, in everything, not haunting, guiding. That's the thing about people like her. They never truly leave. They become the architecture of the person you build after them. One morning, he walked into the house holding a seashell. It was cracked, weathered, nothing special. But inside, he'd tucked a note. It read, "If it breaks, I'll rebuild it better." That's when I knew they were ready. Not for the sea, but for everything. And so, I gave them something I hadn't given anyone in years. My journal. I'd written in it for decades. Notes on the markets, on philosophy, on people, on love, on failure, on the kind of wealth you don't report to the IRS. "Read it slowly," I said, "and only when it rains." That night, as I sat watching their fire flicker down the beach, I realized I was no longer just watching them. I was watching legacy take root, quietly, naturally, without force, not like a monument, like a lighthouse, lit for the next traveler. And then came the moment I hadn't expected. They asked me if I wanted to sail with them, just once. "Not far," she said, "just enough." I hesitated. It had been years. My hands didn't move like they used to. But then I remembered the letter. "If you're still here, you're not done." So I stood up, grabbed my coat, and walked toward the boat. The sun was low, the tide steady, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't thinking about risk. I was thinking about rhythm. The rhythm of oars, of breath, of legacy passed hand to hand. not in words, but in example. We pushed off. The boat cut through the water smooth and slow, like it had been waiting all this time for us. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. She steered. He adjusted the sail. And I watched the shoreline disappear behind us, not with fear, with peace. Because now I knew, even if this boat didn't come back, the story would. Later that night, back on the sand, I wrote one final line in a new journal. The sea doesn't care if you're ready, but now, I am. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Time is the one investment we never get back, and you chose to spend some of yours here. That means more than you think. If this story gave you something, a thought, a pause, maybe even a bit of peace, then it did its job. Take what you need, leave what you don't. But whatever you do, don't forget to patch your nets, check the horizon, and live like the tide might change tomorrow. Until next time.